What China would like to do is project itself as being essentially a sort of global peacemaker. It's tried to do this in Ukraine. It would now, I think, try and say that if China can facilitate a conversation, but negotiation between the two sides, it's willing to do that. The difference is, though, with some of the other bigger players like Qatar at the moment, that China is unlikely to really put the kind of hard yards, the big miles into actually bringing peace around. So it wants the credit for being a peacemaker in the Middle East, I'd say, but it doesn't yet have the experience or the depth really to be able to do it.
This meeting is, of course, happening against this backdrop of conflict in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. Let's just start in the Middle East. China have called for a two-state solution and a ceasefire. I think I'm right in saying that they have quite a strong affiliation with Palestine for the last couple of decades, but are increasingly close to Israel. How will that issue come up between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping this week?
Well, you're absolutely right, Daryl, that China has been essentially moving its position quite carefully between Palestine as a concept and Israel in the last 30 years or so. Essentially, it's tried to be friends with everyone. So what that means is that it's made statements in favor of the Palestinian cause, talking about the desire for a two-state solution. But unlike many of the countries in the Middle East, China has always maintained a pretty strong relationship with Israeli government since the early 1990s, when diplomatic relations were first started between the two countries. In addition, China also keeps good relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran, both for reasons, of course, of oil supply, but also because they want to make sure that they're amongst the few powers that everyone is talking to. So overall, that was where China had come in. Recently, during the recent Israel Hamas war, China has been making some rather more pro-Palestinian statements rather than being on the fence. But I think that when it comes to talking to Joe Biden, they're going to move back a little bit to an area of relative neutrality. What China would like to do is project itself as being essentially a sort of global peacemaker. It's tried to do this in Ukraine. It would now, I think, try and say that if China can facilitate a conversation, but negotiation between the two sides, it's willing to do that. The difference is, though, with some of the other bigger players like Qatar at the moment, that China is unlikely to really put the kind of hard yards, the big miles into actually bringing peace around. So it wants the credit for being a peacemaker in the Middle East, I'd say, but it doesn't yet have the experience or the depth really to be able to do it.
Okay. We've considered a lot the conflict in Eastern Europe. Sort of nestled in between those stories, and I guess the future of this region, a consequence of what's happening in other conflicts, is Taiwan. That will be on the agenda again for Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. And I suppose the sort of last time the US and China had a row over this particular thing, it was Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan last year. How did that leave things?
Yeah, I would say that just over a year ago, in August of 2022, when then Speaker of the US House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan, causing China to essentially say that this was an act of outrageous violation of their sovereignty. And ever since then, they've been sending out huge numbers of sorties of aircraft across the airspace of the island to show that they could attack it if they wanted to. The relationship between the US and China has been bad because essentially the US has no formal treaty requirement to defend Taiwan directly. In other words, it's not like Japan, which a little bit like NATO, the US would have to defend if China attacked it. On the other hand, there is the Taiwan Relations Act that means that essentially the US Congress authorizes the supply of arms to Taiwan. So has the potential to be a very dangerous situation. But I would say that in the last year, things have actually changed and for the better, assuming that we think that lower temperature is better in the region. I'd say there's two reasons for that. Broadly, on Joe Biden's side, on the US side, the United States has made tremendous numbers of efforts to get dialogue going with China. It's sent a lot of significant people from the US political scene, senior senators, people like Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, people like Gina Raimondo, the US Commerce Secretary, who actually managed to flog a few Boeing aircraft, I think, when she was there. And the Chinese side want to bring the temperature down as well. Why? Because actually, in the last 3 or 4 months, Daryl, the big story on China has shifted from being Taiwan must be reunited with the mainland to our economy is doing really badly. We've got high youth unemployment. We haven't got a model at the moment to essentially build up growth post-COVID. And that's where we need to have a more cooperative relationship with the outside world so that China's economy can get back to that 4 to 5% growth that it needs to essentially keep the middle class happy. And because of that, Xi Jinping is now willing to talk more cooperatively on Taiwan to the United States to some extent.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Fascinating to see the economic picture in China play into all of those, play into things like its relationship with the US at the moment. Really interesting. I just want to pick up on this as well, Rana, because we're told by US officials that election interference will also be on the table. In what context?
Yes, I think this is probably a more general sort of warning than specific. The reason I say that is that I think it's generally well known amongst those who look at these things that Russia has been much more involved in direct interference in electoral systems around the world, mainly because Russia has an interest in sort of overturning the results of certain types of more liberal parties being elected. Up to now, I'm not aware that China has been actually seen as a direct threat in terms of election interference. But what people do know is that because China's technology is moving so fast, because quantum computing, artificial intelligence, these are all areas where China has really been making leaps and bounds in the last few years. I think that there will be a generalized warning from the United States that it does regard any attempt to try and intervene in US politics to be off the out of bounds and completely beyond the pale. So my sense is that at the moment it's more of a sort of quiet warning rather than a specific concern about any particular part of US democracy. One has to say I'm speaking to you from the United States, Daryl, and the US is doing its own quite good job of giving its own citizens things to worry about on democratic grounds without worrying about the Chinese.
Okay, well, on that note, Rana, Donald Trump was speaking at a rally yesterday about President Xi. I don't know if you saw this or not, a clip of this, but he was claiming to have had a good relationship with him. He also cited Putin and Kim Jong-un as people that he had a good relationship with. He cited him as controlling 1.4 billion people with an iron hand, he said, and then went on to suggest that leads to there being no drug problems in China. I mean, it was sort of borderline endorsement, really, of Xi Jinping. But a bigger question on that front, Rana, and it is a big question in a couple of minutes, what happens to that relationship if Trump is elected again a year from now?
Good question, Daryl. Well, I would say that first bonding between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, and I think it was real, at least for a while, they had a certain amount of regard for each other, it seems, was made over what I think Donald Trump called the biggest, most beautiful piece of chocolate cake you'd ever seen, which he offered to Xi Jinping while announcing that he, Donald Trump, had just, I think, said he was going to bomb Syria. So there's a bonding moment for you. Let's get to 2023 and 2024-5, which, of course, is when the next US election will both be fought, and then, of course, the result will be known. I think that right now there is some evidence that the Chinese are quite interested in the idea of having Donald Trump re-elected to the second term as president. That may sound counterintuitive, because you remember that he spoke very harshly about China. But I think there is this strong feeling in China that it's not clear what the United States would do in terms of international alliances under President Trump, part two, if there is one. It may be that he actually doubles down and essentially uses his alliances in NATO and elsewhere to try and create new ways of essentially pushing back against China. Or it may be the case that Donald Trump says, our business is at home. Basically, the US has spent far too long getting involved overseas in international, wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's no way we're going to have one in China. And if that was the case, then essentially China would take that as a signal that maybe they would get tacit permission to sort out the Taiwan issue on their own. Now, it has to be said that at the end of the last Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually pushed very hard on the Taiwan question. There was no question, it seemed, of him actually sort of giving China a free hand. So in a sense, this is a bit of a punt by China. But I think they think that if Biden is reelected, then essentially the current pretty strong policy of keeping China somewhat contained will continue. So from their point of view, it's more like taking a bit of a bet on something that might just be different.